I'm very excited to welcome you guys to the Cutting Edge Issues in Development series that's hosted by the International Development Department at the LSE. My name is Mann, and I'm an associate professor in the department, and I'm the convener of the series this year. Along with Deepa Patel and Maya Bullen, I'm not sure where Maya, oh, there's Maya. We have organized a great series of speakers for you this year, and I'm very excited about it. We have a broad range of topics, including next week we have a lecture on the crisis of peacekeeping. We have the history of the Industrial Revolution, China, US, trade relations, the crisis of multilateralism, and many, many more. But this week we're going to be touching upon a lot of these different issues, but specifically focusing on aid and the position of UK aid within these sets of challenges. And we have two wonderful speakers to guide us through this discussion. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping matters. The first thing is that this is going to be recorded and made available on YouTube and as a podcast. The second thing is I kindly ask for you guys to silence your phones. And the third thing is that in case we have a fire, I need to tell you that the meeting point is out of the So Sui Hock building. Hopefully we'll be able to guide you there. The order of today's session is we're first going to have a discussion, a Q&A on the stage. We're going to finish at around 5:15, 5:10, and then we're going to open it up for questions from you guys. And in this series, we have a tradition of students asking very thoughtful and sometimes challenging questions to our speakers. So I really hope that you guys will carry on this tradition today. And we have roving mics on both levels, so people anywhere in the room can ask a question. And I urge you to think about questions as we're going. We have to finish a little bit before 6 today, so we're going to finish, and then if you have other questions, we're going to go to the pub, the White Horse pub, so you can ask more questions there as well. So I have to introduce our wonderful speakers. So first of all, we have Clare Short, who many of you will be aware is the former Secretary of State for International Development under the Labour government under Tony Blair. She's probably going to tell us about how, in that period, the International Development Department of the government was separate, and it was run in a very different way from how things are being run today. So we're going to talk a little bit about her experiences and what she learned from that experience in terms of what are the principles of a good aid agenda. She resigned. She wasn't happy about the Labour government's role in the Iraq War, and she resigned in 2003 as the Secretary of State for International Development, but remained an MP for Birmingham and Ladywood until, I think, 2010. And since then, she's remained really active in discussions around development, particularly through the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. She's also regularly writing about development. And today's session today was actually in part inspired by a piece that she wrote that had been intended to kind of provoke discussions about the future of foreign policy under a new Labour government, which I've shared with all the ID students this afternoon. If you're not an ID student and you want to read it, it's available on Clare's website. The title is, what is it? Reconsidering Britain's Role in the World. So we're going to talk about that piece a little bit today. So second of all, we are joined by Kevin Watkins. He is a visiting professor in our own Firoz Lalji Center for Africa at the LSE. He's also a former executive director of Save the Children, a former executive director of the think tank Overseas Development Institute. Before that, he worked for Oxfam. He's also worked in the UN. He was involved in part of the UN that writes the Human Development Report for several years. And he, like Clare, has a very deep and I think critical knowledge of the aid sector and how it works. He's also recently, he's published a lot of different important things, but most recently he was asked to write a piece for the Brazilian presidency of the G20 about financing development and financing the SDGs. So in today's, as I said, in today's session, we're going to be touching on a number of the issues that are likely to come up later in the series. But today we really want to focus on sort of broader changes in the world system and the world order and how these changes are likely to affect aid and the way that aid is today. So can we please give a round of applause for our two speakers? Okay, so the first question that I have for you both is, what do you think is a kind of good aid agenda look like? What are the principles? What are the structures that make aid effective? So maybe can I start with you, Clare?
I think first thing to say is aid is not development. It's part of it, but people talk as though aid is development, whereas getting fair taxation systems and trade rules and all the rest, of the international system is as important, if not more important. So don't get trapped into that, it's only aid. It's bigger than that. But obviously, if there's some money to spend, it can be spent well or badly, or there can be less or more. And I think well-spent aid, and it's very like public expenditure in our own countries. Is it raised in a fair way? Is it focused on those who most in need? In this country, what is it? 70% of children go hungry in this country? But so good aid spending is, one, it should have long-term commitments. Two, it should be partnerships with developing countries, ideally around agendas that are agreed through the international system. So it isn't the donor telling the recipient what to do, it's an agreed objective that both sides work for. I mean, thirdly, you shouldn't have lots of there's far too many players in aid. Even the bilaterals, you shouldn't have lots of them with lots of different programs. Of course, if you can all get behind an agreed international program, then you can get all the money into one thing and you don't burn the country with masses of accounting and meeting ministers that come every week, and even different bank accounts, that is all bureaucracy and effort and distraction. And of course that's what this is a long time ago, you probably all weren't born, but the Millennium Development Goals were about that. They were drawn from a series of UN conferences that agreed on the most effective results of different development work, for health, for education, for reproductive health, whatever. So everyone had voted for them. And then the millennium, they didn't know what to do with it. The Soviet Union had collapsed. What the heck are we going to do? So suddenly the idea of the whole world focusing on the systematic reduction of poverty became the objective, because they didn't know what to do. All the spy agencies didn't know the Soviet Union was collapsing. When you read those novels, you think they know what they're doing. They didn't know. No, but it's good to remember, all these people who pretend they know everything. So we had a moment in development then. We could pick up the UN conference conclusions. We got agreement on the Millennium Development Goals through the UN system, all countries voting for it. So then you could all unite and say to a country, okay, how do we get all the kids into school? How do we get your health service working better? Pool the money, get long-term plans, measure the effectiveness of both. Not just the donors telling the country what to do, but of course in countries you get bad elements too. So it's good to have some sort of external objective where everyone's measured. That's what good aid looks like. Mm-hmm. And we're a million miles from it now, I'm afraid. A million miles. Including the UK is shamefully backward now. Don't have any delusions, just because once we did some good work, not anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Kevin, do you have anything to add? So we've got long-term international cooperation.
Well, that was pretty comprehensive. Good aid pretty much looks like the opposite of what we have in the international system right now. And I would say good aid would have a number of features. The first would be the way that it's framed. Too often aid is sort of pitched as an act of charity and not as an act of solidarity. And there's a very big difference in the sort of narratives that come with charity versus the narratives that come with solidarity. And that really matters. I think, secondly, good aid has a strategic purpose. And, I'm sure we'll come on to this later, but, one of the things that Clare did in her career at the Department for International Development was to link what we did on aid to a much wider agenda for changing the international system. The white paper on globalization, I think it was a really important part of that agenda. Because if you have good aid policies, but bad trade policies, or you fail to tackle the debt problems facing low-income countries, you're basically pouring aid into a bucket with a hole in the bottom, which is exactly what we're doing right now by not tackling the debt crisis. I'd say, thirdly, a really important feature of aid is that it needs to be linked to a sort of coherent agenda. And I mean, Clare mentioned child poverty in Britain, and it is germane to this discussion because the successor to the Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the architects of those goals was David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. And his specific contribution, as he always said, was he was the person who put two things on the agenda. The first was, as he called it, the golden thread, which was anti-corruption, governance, and so on. The second thing was leave no one behind. Now, this was the Prime Minister that oversaw the biggest increase in child poverty in Britain in 20 years, who was standing on a world stage saying, I'm committed to the eradication of poverty. And that
so
is
an
a
important point is that lots of the discussion of aid is pure hypocrisy. Watch that too.
Yeah, but it's a super important point. I mean, there's a very big difference when a Prime Minister like David Cameron takes a stand on behalf of the world's poor as a sort of abstract entity, while treating the poor in his own backyard in a way that's really despicable. Very different than, say, the approach of the Brazilian government in the G20 now, with a very strong track record on poverty reduction. So I think the cohesiveness part of the story is a really important one. Don't make a stand for aid while turning a blind eye to war crimes in Gaza and the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding there. That is hypocrisy as well. The last point I would make is I think the purpose of aid brings with it a danger of aid dependence. And so it's really important that aid is structured in a way that both supports what national governments and national actors and reformers are trying to do, but doesn't hook countries into a sort of long-term dependence on aid. So it has to be about building capacity and supporting change at the national level.
If I can ask you guys a slightly critical follow-up question. The MDGs and the SDGs, they have also been criticized for kind of, taking the development vision away from governments and having these targets. I mean, what would you say to that in terms of kind of maintaining country ownership over the development?
I think that is completely untrue criticism, in that all the countries in the world voted for the Millennium Development Goals. That was part of the beauty. One, they came out of UN work. And, in developing countries, people have a lot more respect for the UN than they do for multilateral development banks and so on. So everyone had agreed them. And so it wasn't one side telling the other side what to do. And the other thing is, measurably, from 2000 till 2020 something, the levels of extreme poverty in the world did decline considerably. And a lot more, in the least developed countries, a lot more children went to school, less children died before the age of 5, life expectancy went up. It's not perfection, but it was measurable progress. So it's not perfect, there's no perfection in this life, but it was measurable progress, and that meant a lot of difference to a lot of very poor people's lives.
Okay, but in terms of sort of coordinating, having silos, these very defined targets, I don't know.
Well, I'm not agree. I think you need focus in anything you do in government or in any institution, but not to drown in bureaucratic target accountability. So clear objectives. If you're working with a country and, 20% of children are in school, and you want to get to 100%, but you agree, that's another thing, budgetary aid, we haven't mentioned that. I think it's really important to put the money through government systems, and by doing that, you of course have to account to your taxpayers for the money, so there's a way of sort of tightening up financial management in the country without any intrusion, because you've agreed on the objective. So, measurable increase in the children going to school, measurable increase in children getting vaccinated so they don't die, measurable increase in transfer of funds so there's less hunger. I mean, who can be against this? I mean, there's lots of things wrong with aid, there's lots of hypocrisy, misuse, but these fundamental things, and there was measurable achievement, who can be against that?
Okay, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, I mean, the thing I would add, so, I mean, the great strength of the Millennium Development Goals, in a way, was that they were quite focused. How many were there?
6.
6. So there were 6 goals, very clear. Universal education, halving poverty, child mortality targets. And these were all...
Reduce maternal mortality.
And maternal mortality. So there were very achievable, monitorable targets, which are important for accountability. And it was linked to wider stuff that was going on. So, Jim Wolfenson, who was president of the World Bank at that time, really refocused a lot of the work of the bank on the poverty agenda. Now, it wasn't unproblematic, but it sort of shifted things in a pro-poor, anti-poverty direction. The sustainable development goals, I mean, maybe we'll discuss this later. I think any strategy which includes 169 separate targets, some of which are plausible, many of which are not plausible. I always say with setting goals, they have to pass 2 tests, which is one, the motivational test. Can you do this? Like, is this worth getting out of bed for? Is it worth fighting for? Really important. Second thing, does it pass the laugh out loud test? Can you actually achieve it? Some of the SDGs were not achievable, and that's actually an insult to the presumed beneficiaries of the goals, and there was very little accountability for that. And I think Clare is right. Having a small number of achievable targets really matters for international institutions, for national governments as well. There is a challenge, I think, with the SDGs that, whether they're intended as silos or not, an unintended consequence is that, child health becomes a UNICEF issue. Education becomes a UNESCO issue. Monetary poverty is the World Bank issue. And institutions don't work well across their institutional boundaries. They're competitive on fundraising, they're competitive on influence. But in a way, that's the problem of the architecture. It's not a problem with the target itself.
Okay. So I want us to zoom out a little bit now to talk about the kind of international context or the world order in which these kinds of programs play out. And I kind of took from what you said, Clare, that when you were the Secretary of State for International Development, it was a kind of more hospitable world at the end of the Cold War. And
I actually think the world didn't quite know what to do. We won the election in 97, so the collapse of the Soviet Union, 89. But so even under the Tories, there'd been cuts in defence spending, cuts on spending on the security agencies, because, who do you spy on when the other side has collapsed, And so there am I, a new Secretary of State with the reputation of being a bit of a lefty, and there comes the head of MI6, we call him C, I don't know if you've noticed, it's a sort of affectation in the British system, coming to see me. And of course the truth is, he thinks she's got a budget, it wasn't very big then. We don't have a budget, nobody knows, and I'm saying, but what are you offering? You want to spy on the governments that I'm working in partnership with? So we had those kind of discussions. And then there was an admiral who came to see me and said, could we fit out a ship to go to emergencies? So they were all trying to get in on development because they didn't know what they were doing. And our job was to turn that into something, not a lot of tokenistic, this and that and the other thing, but it created an opportunity for them picking up the MDGs and getting the world to focus. I mean, for example, we had a big debt problem then, just as we have now, and a big civil society campaign to relieve the debt. And it was unconditional debt relief, do you remember? And I'm saying no. the debt relief must be in return for spending the money on reducing poverty in the countries, not, buying Rolls Royces for the members of the government or whatever, because those things do happen. And we did shift it, and we shifted the World Bank then and the IMF to get behind the objectives, because this was HIPIC, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, but the focus of success when you got into a program to get your debt written off was making progress on poverty. And I think that was good, and we got the world system to unite. But so it was a time of opportunity, but they weren't all queuing up to do development, they were queuing up to find out what to do. And some of us grabbed it. I think that's... And really we must ask ourselves, why have we lost it? What happened? What creates a zeitgeist that lasted 20, 25 years, and now it's gone?
So that was my question, is in what ways is the international system become less hospitable to development and to kind of a coherent aid agenda? And what do you think has driven that change?
Kevin? No, I'll come in, but I mean...
I mean, look, there's a lot, there's many different things. Like, I think it's really important to bear in mind that if you look back over the longer term, I mean, let's separate the UK and the global state. So, what we had in the UK, like I can remember when I was in Oxfam, and there was a budget before '97. You could pre-write the press release because the only question was going to be how much was the aid budget going to be cut by, and how little was the government going to do on debt. What we had after '97, I think, was a really big shift in the way that people thought about development because of the work that Clare did in DFID, that Gordon Brown became a champion of debt relief on the international stage. There was lots of other stuff about campaigns and so on that were developing. So we had this sort of big push towards development in the UK, which started to dissipate after austerity. And we'll come back to that in the discussion, I think. On the international stage, actually the first 15 years of the 2000s were a really extraordinary period. And I think people forget this, a billion people lifted above the extreme poverty threshold, a complete transformation of the numbers of children getting into school, learning outcomes a bit different, a really big acceleration in progress on child survival. Like, these things changed lives. There were a lot of interventions, like the creation of the global funds and all of that sort of thing, of which the UK aid budget was a contributory part. After 2015, it all slowed down quite dramatically, and then with the pandemic went into reverse. And I think there are all sorts of reasons for that. In the case of extreme poverty, it's because the closer you get to the edge, the next step becomes more difficult. It's it's the marginal cost, if you like, of reaching the next disadvantaged person goes up. I mean, we've obviously seen a real weakening of the multilateral system, and that's to do with the the fragmentation of the order. The rise of China and emerging markets, a failure to integrate them into the Bretton Woods mechanisms in the right way. I think we've seen fundamental failures of leadership on the part of the G7. We look at the response to the pandemic. Immunise your citizens, forget Africa. I mean, that's the key message that you would take from the pandemic response. So I think there are many different factors, and I think the big challenge now to turn it into a positive is how do we find the causes and the issues and the narratives and the coalitions that can, I don't think you can recreate that period of the early 2000s, but you can build something that's different and better than we've got now.
There's another thing, Kevin hinted at it before, but if you're going deeply for neoliberalism and all your countries are becoming more unequal and there's poverty in the countries that normally should contribute to the aid budget, the spirit of the country gets meaner, there's more room for nasty right-wing rhetoric, and then appealing to people, which is, we need a sustainable future. There's something in this for all of us. It isn't just be nice to poor people. It's a sensible, long-term, sensible strategy. But you lose that kind of discourse because people are mean and nasty and hurt. And so you can't get a just world order if you're getting a more unjust order in your own countries. You know, it's a contradiction. You said that, but I mean, it's very important. So we have to, you can't say, let's have a lovely international development system, but home is hopeless. You've got to make both better.
Could I just add
Yeah.
to that really briefly? You know, for a spell, as you said, I was CEO of Save the Children. And you know, you could really see that from an NGO perspective, that after 2007, 2008, I think politics, you know, the underlying causes are very, you know, complex and all that, but there was a definite shift in politics that opened the door to this inward-looking, populist, right-wing nationalism. You know, your own backyard comes first. And you could see it really clearly in the narratives of the media. And I think the big mistake that we made in the NGO sector is that we just picked it up way too late. That, you know, we were using the language of the first decade of the 2000s in the, you know, in the 10 years after 2008. And I think that was a really big mistake. So the rise of right-wing populism, I think, has been an absolute game changer in the way that people think about development in the UK.
It's not just the UK, this is worldwide.
Worldwide.
The cuts are everywhere, the nasty nationalism, the inequality. This is a global phenomenon that I think explains the racism, the anti-immigrant, the mean-spirited politics that's across the world. But the lesson of that is you've got to demand justice at home and internationally. You can't go for one and not the other. That's really, really important.
So one of the things I wanted us to talk about today was kind of what happened to DFID and the kind of, I don't know, merger or the takeover of DFID by the Foreign Office and what the consequences of that were. But I think it's also important to talk a little bit about some of the kind of broader creeping trends. So the kind of mixing of security and military with aid, the mixing of trade and immigration, you know, the instrumentalization of the aid industry to get things that you want from other countries, the increasing role of corporate interests in development and the kind of instrumentalization of the aid industry when it comes to British commercial interests. So I don't want us to become too pessimistic, but I'd like you to talk a little bit about those kinds of forces, and perhaps if we can ask Clare to be optimistic about the future, whether you think there is any prospects that this new Labour government will kind of reverse some of those tendencies and some of the structural changes that were made under Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak.
Science so far on this new Labour government is that it's really not Labour, I'm afraid, and I'm very pessimistic. I think you're having Mark Lowcock here and his book on the rise and fall of DFID. Is that one of these sessions?
It's not within this session, but I think it's going to be.
You're coming too. I'm coming.
And Clare is coming back.
I've read the book. I mean, it answers these questions. But there's a thing here for campaigners. The Tories had taken over. Andrew Mitchell had decided to stick, because at first it was seen that the Labour government was seen as having done really well on development, and the country was sort of proud of it at that time. So it was seen as an attractive policy, and the Tory party wanted...
Maybe just to help the students, what years were those? Because I don't know how old everybody is.
When did they take over? 2010?
Yeah.
But the Tory party had been known, as Theresa May, who was a Tory Prime Minister, as the nasty party. After Thatcher and all that, she was pretty nasty. And things got very unequal, and we had very high unemployment, and we had riots. So they were trying to not be the nasty party anymore. So embracing development was seen as softening for the image. But then we got massive cuts in all public programmes right across the piece, but increases in the aid budget. Now that was disastrous. It set up the right-wing media to attack. It set up all the other government departments to be angry and jealous. You know, they were getting slashed. And then there's more and more money going into the aid budget. So then, of course, they started to please them, sprinkling the money through different departments. And then that's just nonsense. It means it's badly spent, you don't know what they're spending it on, and you get all these military aid, or what does the MOD want to do? Really, they're doing development. Even I had a big row with Blair in our day. He wanted to return, I guess it's not a new story, asylum seekers to countries, that they'd come from. And he wanted to make aid conditional. And I said, you can't. We've passed a law saying you can only spend it for the purposes of reducing poverty. This is not reducing poverty. No, Tony, you can't do it. And he was furious. But that, insisting on a big growth, the NGOs made a big mistake then. And it's connected to that point I made before. If you're not looking after the country and you just say you're doing development, you're going to make everybody angry and you're going to lose it. And that's what happened.
So I just wanted to ask you guys a little bit about how did changing differed from a standalone organisation into a part of the Foreign Office. What did that do to the aid agenda in the UK? I don't know if I can ask you this.
Well, Claire is going to give a way better answer than I am, but I think it did a lot of things. I think one of the really important things DFID did was set a strategic direction, and that direction was unravelled under the Conservatives. But we had 2 white papers. We had the Development Act in 2004. I can't remember whenever. But we had.
I think. 2002.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, we had a really clear strategic direction. I think development went from being a sort of fringe issue to being something that was really mainstream in government, and the way that the aid agenda and the debt agenda and the trade agenda was starting to join up, I think was incredibly important. Just because we're speaking bluntly, so I think one of the huge mistakes that NGOs made, there was a slogan, if you remember, around the Jubilee campaign, which was double aid to halve poverty. That was a really stupid slogan because it was hubristic. It was give more money through aid and we'll pretend through contrived evidence and implausible examples that this is going to somehow transform the world. And I think that was an example of where the curve of campaigning got out of alignment with the sort of the real curve of political economy and domestic politics. So that was a big mistake. But I think those foundations that were laid, and to go back to your earlier questions, I think it's really regrettable, to put it diplomatically, that the new government hasn't made some sort of commitment to restoring the institutional structure that we had with DFID. And when you hear the government use the phrase that we will increase the aid budget when fiscal circumstances allow.
Never.
Yeah, that's coda for where is the long grass and how far do I have to kick this. So, I think the new government hasn't got off to a good start in this area.
In any area, actually, I think. Very disappointing, and my expectations were low to start with. The 2-child, I don't know if you know about the cap on the benefit for families who have more than 2 children. The Tories brought in this mean thing that if you had a 3rd child, you couldn't get the normal family allowance for that child. And it's the single thing that's causing a growth in child poverty. And Labour was committed to reverse it and has dropped it. I mean, please. What's Labour for? I just want to say another thing about the Foreign Office. Always hated the idea of the Department for International Development being established because they want to control the money. They're extremely bad at managing money, but they want to dollop the money on British interests. Well, that is not development. There's a famous Sir John Vereker, worked in the ODA, as it was then called, for years, and he said, once he had to fund a band out of the aid budget to play because Princess Anne was visiting the country. I mean, that's a trivial example, but you see the way in which the spending is distorted. And when Boris Johnson abolished the FID, he said, They keep making me spend money in Zambia when I want to spend it somewhere else. So that was the Foreign Office influence. And the second thing, so I mean, they wanted it, and they kept, and then as aid got criticised and there was stupid campaigns and so on, Boris Johnson bought it and just abolished it overnight. I mean, there's another thing, even under the Thatcher years and so on, there was a separate part of the Foreign Office that administered aid, only aid. It didn't have skills in other areas. They don't even have that now. So they've just thrown all the DFID staff into the Foreign Office. There's no specialisation. We had some of the best people in the world, and they're leaving and losing their skills. So, and this wretched lot haven't even re-established that structure inside the Foreign Office. And the third thing is, development is not just money for aid, and we must get over that. So when you have a Department for International Development, you can have trade expertise, and then you challenge your trade department. What about this trade negotiation? And we had big battles with all these departments, and the senior officials couldn't bear us saying things about trade, but the junior officials said, oh, you don't just want us to negotiate British interests, you want us to make a more just international trading system. And they got quite excited, and so on. Tax, you know, lots of developing countries, you have corrupt individuals who get lots of money and then take it out of the country and don't pay any tax. Similarly, global corporations. This is a massive issue. If they paid their taxes properly, it would be more money than the aid programs, etc. So, and of course, if you've got a specialist department, you get specialism in all this, and you have to challenge inside your government, and it's hard because you're taking on all the vested interest, arms sales, you know, trying to say, no, this country can't afford to buy those arms and they need to get the kids into school or whatever. We had that over Tanzania air traffic control. So it's battle. It's not just aid. Well, if you have a bit in the Foreign Office distributing the budget, you've lost all of that.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, not excellent, but excellent information. So I want us to shift now to talk a little bit about beyond aid, looking at kind of international infrastructures beyond aid. So things like World Bank, IMF, the UN Security Council. I think many students will be very happy to criticize these kinds of organizations as being neo-colonial in terms of the World Bank president always being an American, the IMF being European, the 5 permanent members of
the Americans think they made a big mistake there. How did they give the IMF to a European and only keep the World Bank for themselves? Oh, but they have.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the potential reform of some of these broader systems and Britain's role in it. In Clare's piece that she wrote, she kind of talked about, you know, what should be Britain's role in a more just foreign policy, and particularly when it came to the UN Security Council and these other systems. So, Clare, can I first start with you to what are the kind of proposals to reform these kinds of systems?
Well, you all know, and especially because of Gaza and now Lebanon and all that disgraceful suffering, killing and slaughter and genocide that is an absolute breach of international law and is being backed by US, UK, EU. Pathetic Biden says, please have a ceasefire, and then he sends bombs every week so that they don't have to. I mean, and you've got the global south, and if you look at the last vote in the General Assembly, the overwhelming majority of countries in the world, was it 124, I think, voting for the enforcement of the International Court of Justice opinion that there's got to immediately stop occupying the occupied territories and stop. So I am answering your question. The multilateral system is breaking down. The ones who talk, oh dear, Russia is breaching international law in Ukraine. Israel breaches international law every single day and has been doing it for a long time. Everything it does in the occupied territories. And this isn't just rhetoric from me, this is the International Court of Justice recent judgment. And there's been other judgments before. So the international system is breaking. The multilateral system is losing respect. People are more and more fed up with the composition of the Security Council. you know, the victors of the Second World War. But quite how France got there, I don't know. But anyway, that's another thing. I think it was just to give Europe a bit more. But it's not going to happen tomorrow, a shift, but I think it's coming, because what's happening is so gross and the world is so angry and the white settler part of the world is so isolated and Israel is so out of control that I think there's going to be some big disruption. And coming on top, of course, of climate change and all the harm of that. And there's going to be a demand for shifting the institutions, like the reorganisation of the Security Council. That's a big voice now. And when the point comes, of course, Britain will lose its seat, quite rightly, because it always just does what America says anyway. But there'll be one European seat. And we need less veto and more countries, etc., more authority in the General Assembly. Similarly with the World Bank and the IMF, they're going to break that rule that it's got to be an American or a European, but we've also got the Chinese Development Bank. I mean, the world is not going to put up with it. If they won't internationalise these existing institutions, new institutions will replace them. So it's a very pessimistic time, but it's also an interesting time that things are going to change. It might get worse before it gets better, but we're in a time of danger, of hurt, look at Gaza, ignoring the International Court of Justice. The big countries are breaking up the international system. Well, either we're going to have absolute chaos and mayhem, and we'll have some more of that, I fear, but then there's going to be a challenge to these institutions, and we're going to be in so much trouble on climate change and so on. I mean, look at all the fires and floods in America, let alone everywhere else. And there's got to be some international cooperation to deal with this for all our benefits. And when that time, this is my own view, as that time comes, there's going to be a real challenge to the balance of all these institutions and to make them more international and more reflective. So your generation can do it. Hang on to it. No, seriously. You'll be actors in all this. And hang on to the objectives and keep banging away, because I think we'll get it. It's either disaster or we will get remarkable reform and change in your lifetime.
I wanted to bring Kevin here because you've been working with the Brazilian presidency, the Brazilian presidency of the G20. A little bit, stepping out of the UK's role, about countries like Brazil's role in this changing international system.
Sure. Can I just pick up a little bit on what Claire? So look, I think you have to separate out different parts of this equation. So the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank in particular, were moulded in 1944, 1945. And actually, what their remit is incredibly relevant and important for the world today. To be able to borrow on international bond markets for a development purpose, to leverage private capital, I would really encourage people to go and read the speeches at the Bretton Woods Conference, because this was a group of leaders.
But it was only doing it for Europe at first. But you can generalise that, of course, after countries have got their independence.
Yeah. But the point I'm making, they were driven by a vision of a different world. And this idea, we can't go back to the 1930s, to the nationalism that led us to war. And I sort of think we're in that moment now, that we have institutional structures that are stuck in the past. And that's true in Bretton Woods. If you look at the distribution of voting rights, Africa has almost no voting rights in the IMF or the World Bank. I think 3% of the total. The Security Council is clearly an anachronism. So there's a big question of institutional reform. It's a great subject for your dissertations, by the way, if any of you are looking for dissertation subjects. There's then what I would describe as related but a bit different, so a substantive part of this. And I just want to give an example of what, to build on what Claire was saying about Gaza. What the UN system has enshrined and what the post-war system enshrined was a basic set of protections, universal protections for citizens around the world, including children. We have a convention on the rights of the child. We have international humanitarian law, which basically establishes the disruption of food aid to children in conflict and civilians in conflict more generally as a war crime. We have international criminal law, the Rome Statute, which has been deployed in different environments. Now, when that gets eroded in any one case, it weakens the system. And the problem with what we've got is that governments pursue their sectional, national and nationalist interests through the Security Council in particular, and turn everything into an issue that's about their strategic, what's in their best strategic interest. Now, what's going on in Gaza is 10,000 children have been killed. They've been killed in schools, they've been killed in hospitals, they've been killed sitting in vehicles. I'm sorry, this is cut and dried war crime territory. There is no question. These are systematic war crimes. Now, when the Prime Minister of the UK stands up and unreservedly and rightly, in my view, condemns Iranian missile attacks on Israel, but says nothing about the violation of children's rights in Gaza, that weakens the system. And a former Attorney General should know better. This is eroding the authority of all of those UN conventions of the International Criminal Court. So that's on the UN side. On the World Bank side, I mean, we'll come back to this in discussion maybe, but the issue with the World Bank is, one, is chronically underfunded. It puts out about $40 billion of finance a year. The investment gap on a conservative estimate for the SDGs and climate is $3 trillion. So it's sort of, it's borderline irrelevant. And there are all sorts of agendas. Actually, there's a really good G20 working group report that looks at that. I think what the Brazilians are trying to do, sorry, this is a really circuitous route.
That's okay.
But what the Brazilians are trying to do is to project onto the world stage through the G20 what the first Lula government, and now this Lula government, did in Brazil, which it entered office with a really strong commitment to cut poverty, to improve child nutrition, and to tackle rural poverty. They were its three core things. It put in place huge cash transfer programs, which had the effect of cutting poverty by about a third in the space of 7 years. Extraordinary. It's actually one of the great untold development success stories, in my view, for the first part of the 2000s. It put in place a national school feeding program, so the kids who went into school didn't go hungry and were in a position to learn. And they rolled out very large-scale rural credit programs. Now, they're trying to do that on the world stage through the G20, and it's incredibly difficult because, the G20 is like quicksand. It's incredibly easy to block whatever you want to block. And they're trying to navigate that by putting in place a sort of structure that will revitalise the sustainable development goals. We can come back to it in more detail maybe in the discussion.
But the Lula government lost the election. I mean, it was a great government. It did those things, and then it lost to Bolsonaro, who scrapped it all.
Yeah.
That's this thing about it isn't just development over there, it comes out of our countries and out of the politics of our countries.
Also,
I mean, not to forget.
No, it's really important.
We've got the Africa Development Bank, the Asia Development Bank,
the
Caribbean Development Bank, we've got the new Chinese-led. So we need to look at the whole thing and improve it. And of course, too many actors is also expensive for countries.
I think, Laura, just on your point, what's important about the Brazilian initiative is that, in the past, in my view, there's been too much emphasis on what the G7 can do for Africa, what the G7 can do to save the world. This is an attempt by an emerging, by a major developing country to drive a global poverty reduction, anti-inequality agenda. They put wealth taxation on the G20 agenda in, I think, an incredible and serious way. Now, what the UK could and should be doing is getting behind that type of initiative, in my view, sort of not turning the tables, but recognising that leadership also is coming from the global south.
Okay.
But of course the G7 are in the G20.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
So it added India, Brazil, who else?
Oh, everyone.
Yeah.
21 actually.
So I have two final questions before we open up for questions from the audience. And the first one is we've already talked a little bit about conflict and the kind of horrific scenes in Palestine and Lebanon, but also in Sudan, in Ukraine, and across the Sahel region as well. And as we've talked about, there's been this kind of collapse in international humanitarian law, and I think a real just failure, particularly when I think about the case of Sudan, of any kind of international effort to prevent this conflict from, now it's just such a protracted civil war. It's very difficult to see how the international community can come together and stop these kinds of conflicts. In a sense, it's a kind of, people are stepping back from this. The US used to be more involved in Sudan, and it's kind of stepped back. So I wanted to talk a little bit about whether you think that there are any hopeful movements or sounds when it comes to the UK to have a more constructive role in resolving these kinds of situations. I don't know. I don't think, Claire, you have very much optimism.
No, the effort has to be led out of somewhere else. And then out of shame and pressure and national debate and criticism, the UK might well join, but it's not going to be a leading player. Of course, it's got history in Sudan, as in so many places.
Yeah.
And of course, Sudan is terrible, but it's also difficult because it's a civil war. I mean, it's domestic.
But with a lot of international actors.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, that's what now happens in
Yeah.
Syria and so the humanitarian effort goes in, but nothing serious about ending the conflict. And as you're right, when there was a conflict between North and South Sudan and the establishment of South Sudan as an independent country, we were all very involved. And I think a lot of hope went into that. And now there's a sort of despair and a complete dysfunction in the international system about ending conflict. In fact, we're just generating them. I mean, so the lead won't come from Britain, but if the world mood shifts, and of course if America tells them, then Britain will go there. I mean, for you, coming to Britain, you might feel disappointed by this, but actually the example of a country that could be a sort of leading progressive player and then not, there's important lessons in that. What can we learn? What changed? How can we get other countries to change, So don't be too despondent that you're in the UK at this dreadful moment. And you might even see so much criticism of the government that you get some change. I think I'm kind of got fingers crossed for the budget and the two-child policy, because they've had such a kicking over the pensioners' cold fuel allowance. Maybe they'll feel the need to do something. So don't be despondent.
I don't know if you want to add anything.
Look, I think it's a really tough question, to be honest with you, because these are national conflicts with regional and international links, and they're very difficult to unravel. It's not like you can sit in London and work out what does a peace settlement look like as a blueprint. I think it's very clear that organisations like the African Union and regional bodies have to play a bigger role.
But they do, much bigger than they used to.
Much bigger than they used to. I think it's also the case that many European countries have run down their diplomatic capabilities over time. Now, there are plenty of cases where diplomatic capabilities haven't been well deployed and effectively used, but in some cases, I think the Foreign Office in the UK did play a significant role in the past in resolving conflicts.
When?
Well, I would say initially with some of the South Sudan settlement that
We were
happened,
involved,
for
that was
example.
my time. We were involved, America was the lead.
Yeah. Yemen to some degree at various periods in the past where, there were ceasefires negotiated with Saudi. I'm not making big claims here, but at the margin, diplomatic effort could make could make a difference. I mean, ultimately, it has to come from within countries and within regional players.
The thing that's missing in this is the UN's role in peacekeeping and peace enforcement and so on used to have a better track record.
Yeah.
I think the kinds of conflicts when they're internal are more difficult.
Yeah.
But that whole machinery needs ramping up and making more effective,
Yeah.
and we need to look at that and not say, oh, let's get the old colonial powers to come again, because
Yeah.
I think people are a bit sick of that.
No, I agree. But, you know, say in DRC, you know, where the UN peacekeeping, I mean, James is sitting in the front row here. I don't want to, you know, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I do think the UN played a significant role there, for example. But, you know, I think one big issue is that the humanitarian system itself is now comprehensively overwhelmed by the scale of the crises that are unfolding. We've actually had last year was the biggest gap ever in the humanitarian system between estimates of need, which are actually an underestimate, and financing provision. And that is clearly going to get worse. And I think that relates to the way that the humanitarian system itself is funded. Mm-hmm. You know, which is essentially all voluntary contributions, which is not the way you fund
But
systemic
actually,
responses.
Britain used to be 5% on humanitarian, it's now over 10.
Yeah.
As you get a world of chaos and
This is-
conflict, you spend more on humanitarian, it's just keeping people alive as their countries are smashed up. I mean, you must do it, but you need to be looking at how can we stop there being such a big humanitarian need. It is growing as a proportion
Yeah.
of the international spend phenomenally.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I might save my last question because I'm kind of very aware that I want to leave time for student questions. But if people are shy, then I'll ask it. So I did want to say before we open up for questions, I do have a very intersectional approach to questions when it comes to gender, nationality, but also location in the room. So please put up your hand. It's my experience that women are shyer at the start and then we run out of time. So if you have a question and you're feeling shy, please still put up your hand. Okay, so let's have, I'll start with this gentleman here in the ribbed jumper downstairs. Do we have any questions upstairs? Maybe the lady in the front row here with the great laptop.
That's not a shy response at all.
No?
You know, some men are shy as well.
Some men are shy. Shy women and shy men, please put up your hand.
Sorry. I really enjoyed the talk, so thank you. I didn't realise there was going to be a mic. But my question was mainly for Clare. So there have been like many examples of British aid being quite corrupt. And decades ago, we had like the famous example of like Tanzania.
Could you maybe put the...
A bit closer?
Oh, yes,
like
that's
I
a
don't know if
better
that's too
angle.
close. But it was mainly for Clare. I was saying there's been many examples of like corruption of British aid, and famously decades ago, like as you know, there was that like incident when Tanzania aid was like diverted to BAE systems. I'm just wondering whether like as we move away from Bretton Woods institutions and we maybe get more reliant, like the global south maybe becomes more reliant on aid from countries in the BRICS political grouping, mainly China, for example. Is there a risk of like new forms of kind of like pitfalls in aid, for example, like debt trap diplomacy? And I think a lot of people kind of bandy around the term neocolonialism, which is a bit like not really defined, but mainly in terms of debt trap diplomacy. Like, how are we going to really prevent that from happening? And is like, how do we mitigate that risk?
Do you do the answer?
I will take a few, and people in the bottom row, but we're going to go to the lady upstairs first, but the lady in the purple here. So first upstairs.
My question is probably for both of you. What value do you place, if any, in the attempted reforms to the international aid and development system that come from within the system itself, not necessarily from states? For example, like nexus approaches that seek to bridge humanitarian aid and long-term development to make it more continuous and coherent across time. Do you see any value in that? That it comes from within rather than states themselves, even though obviously states are heavily involved with their interest in that system. But yeah.
Okay, and lady in the purple.
My question is also for former Secretary Short. It's also more existential than my peers' questions, but I think all factors remaining equal, most of us are eager and hopeful to make positive change. Your lack of faith makes me wonder if I should quit and get my money back. So, but then again, you're sitting here knowing your audience. So my question is, what's your recommendation as we go through this year and on to job searches to create the possibility of decreasing your negative outlook?
That's good feedback for the seminar series earlier. Okay,
Well,
let's...
the corruption's always a danger, and if countries have weak systems, it's a bigger danger. And by and large, poorer countries have weaker government systems. So, the Tanzania air traffic control thing I was very involved in. And it was a guy from the World Bank who exposed it. It was a military system for air traffic control, and Tanzania didn't need a military system. And it cost 20 million, and you could get a civil, because the technology had changed, very much more cheaply. And I and the guy from the World Bank were trying to stop it. The Tanzanian government signed up to it, and there'd been some money, and I nearly got it blocked, and Blair insisted on it, because just to sell British stuff. It got exposed in the end, the legal case came through America, they had to pay some money back to Tanzania, so that one got caught. New actors, there will be more corruption. It is a disease of bad humanity. We have to build systems that are less easily corrupted. It's not one nationality or another, or colonial powers or not, that do it. I'm afraid the risk is everywhere, and really strong, clean, transparent systems are the answer, and we have to keep working at it. Reform from within, yes. There are some good people who work in the international, the World Bank, etc. It is loaded in bureaucracy as an institution. It has brilliant, brilliant people, but it's very, very bureaucratic. But there's always people trying to get reform in all institutions. It's true in developing countries that are badly governed. There's always some good people inside the system trying to make things be better, and they've always got to be backed. So yes, we want reform coming from all over, but there aren't just sort of a good some. And then I'm not selling you pessimism, I'm selling you truth. And I think, as I said, the example of Britain being a leading progressive player and then losing it, there's a very important lessons in it. If it could become that and then lose it, it can become it again, and it teaches you about other countries and what can and can't be done. You know this Gramsci saying, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will? The world's in a bad state at the moment, and we need to be clear about what's going wrong and then have the optimism of our will that we're not going to live with this. It can be changed. We've changed it before. We've had periods of history when the world moved forward. We've been moving back, and we've got to move forward again, and you've got to be part of it. And it's not just Britain. France has gone backwards, Germany's gone backwards on development, etc. Sweden even, these little heroes. So I don't think you can go anywhere else, and it's learn from what went wrong so we can build something better.
And it's
pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Hang on to that one, dear old Gramsci.
And the kind of flux of things, I've heard a lot of your talks in the past. We got you to talk about under DFID, before DFID, that there's a kind of back and forth when it comes to aid in this country, of it shifting into the Foreign Office, out of the Foreign Office, the kind of political settlement in this country changing.
But this country's become much more unequal. It's not just the development programme. And that's the disappointment of the Labour government, that, what Labour government's for, they're for reducing inequality, and so far. But hopefully they'll get so embarrassed you'll see that improve. And, you might be part of it. So I'm not trying to sell pessimism, but we have to face reality and then know where to push and what we can learn. And so.
Kevin?
Well, just to maybe add a two really quick points. So on the reform of the system, so one of the areas where I think reform is really urgently needed, and I think the person who asked the question was alluding to this, is on this, it's called what you call the nexus, which is the interface between humanitarian and development action. And like it or not, like humanitarians, actually and development thinkers as well, always like to say there's a bridge and there's a continuum from humanitarian action to development investment. And actually no, there's not. Like, in the way that the funding structures are organised, they're entirely separate. The humanitarian system is essentially funded by voluntary response to crisis. If you get in the news, you get a lot of money. If you're not in the news, you get very little, which is why the responses are so unequal. In my view, the climate crisis has basically completely destroyed the boundaries between the humanitarian system and how we think about development, and the funding architecture and the aid architecture hasn't caught up with that. It's starting to shift a little bit in the World Bank and in some donors, but we're way a long way from where we need to be. Definitely don't leave the course. That's absolutely for sure. And since we're quoting leftists, as Mark said, the point is not to just understand the world, it's to change it. And the skills and the competencies that you're going to develop in this course are going to put you in a position where if you want to, you can make a difference. That you can drive change, you can support change, you can act in solidarity in an effective way. And that's worth doing. So don't leave.
Okay, so more questions. I'm going to take two from the top and one from the down this time. So let's do this lady here in the glasses, and down here this gentleman with the great beard.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, I can't see you. Go ahead.
And can you put the microphone like
that? Ah,
Taylor
there you
Swift
go.
impressions?
Yeah, exactly. I wish. So my question goes to the point you made at the beginning around aid not being development, but just part of it. And I'm curious whether you both can share a couple of thoughts on what other things beyond aid you think would make a big difference to development.
Okay. And the gentleman down here?
Yes, you were mentioning earlier that funding should be channeled through governments. And just a couple days ago, we had a talk here where you're sitting, there was LSE alum saying that yes, that should be the case, but that was even the case in autocratic countries. And she said twice, paraphrasing, democracy just isn't for everyone. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that, because she went a bit unchallenged.
Okay. And the lady upstairs.
Yes, hi. My question's for Professor Watkins. You used a really interesting phrase in your original remarks where you said that aid should be sort of thought as an act of solidarity and not charity, which is a great rhyming phrase, but also I think a very good vision. And I'm curious how you think we would work towards that, promoting solidarity versus charity more. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll have those three questions.
What is apart from funding aid, a just trade system, access to markets? I mean, if you look at the poorest countries, they tend to export unprocessed goods because their access to markets is, distorts that. And of course, the possibility of getting in with investment. So trade is very, very important.
And just to jump in there, not just market access, but making it difficult for things like regional trade integration, for example, within Africa, not having the rules so that you're kind of undermining efforts.
Though Africa's moving to integrate quite considerably.
But a lot of the EPAs kind of slightly undermined that process.
Tax, I mentioned tax. If you look, there was a report by Thabo Mbeki, and it's a few years back, not many, maybe 7, 10 even, but just tracing how much money comes out of the poorest countries by tax systems, and it's phenomenal. And I mean, there has been this big negotiation actually through the OECD to get companies to pay tax in the place where they have activity rather than where they've got their headquarters. And that all needs following up and implementing, and it would bring a lot of proceeds into poor countries that don't get them at the moment. Conflict and resolving conflict. I mean, if countries fall into conflict, and they often do because if they're very poor and then become divided and then conflict, resolving conflict is part of development. Climate change, I mean, we've got, the poorest countries are the worst affected, made least contribution, but you can take action on climate change that benefits low-income people or not. You can tick the box on climate change, but it's not bringing anything to the poorest people. I mean, that needs looking at as a development issue, not just notching up big figures. And I mean, there's more, but that would do for a start. This democracy isn't for everyone is becoming a more and more common statement, in America in particular, I've noticed, but no, it is. Democracy, I mean, what is it? But the possibility for people to get together and vote out a bad government is key. I mean, democracy is very limited because you've got billionaires owning the media. In the case of America, it's money politics. It's not a democracy, it's an oligopoly. So it's a limited democracy, but the people must have the chance to vote out bad governments. I mean, hold on to that at any price, because otherwise you just get endless dictatorship and so on. Right. Well, and of course, stop it being corrupted. But it's becoming fashionable to say, it can't make decisions. We need a kind of beneficial, benevolent dictator. I mean, this is very dangerous, and it's becoming a bit of a fashion, and we must challenge it. Aid, solidarity, not charity. That was Kevin's phrase, so I'll leave it to him. But I want to say, it's not even solidarity. It's about a sustainable world order that we all need. I mean, solidarity is like standing with someone when they're in trouble. But it's more than that, isn't it? We're all in trouble. And a more just and sustainable world order we all need. So I'm not knocking the phrase, but, it's more than that.
So look, I would say on the first question about development being about more than aid, let's just give a few snapshot examples. Currently, low-income and low-middle-income countries around the world are spending about twice as much on debt repayment as they're spending on healthcare. They're spending more on repaying debts than they're spending on education. If you stopped that, it would provide governments with the control over their own revenues to invest. Basically, governments are being pushed by the failure of debt governance to maintain payments to their creditors, but to default on the rights of their own citizens. That's a failure of governance. It goes way beyond aid. We can go into detail of it if you want.
And it goes back to the question about democracy. You can't have a sustainable democracy in that kind of situation.
Yeah. Now, the specific issue on debt is that unlike, Claire, when you were dealing with the heavily indebted poor countries initiative, that was mainly multilateral debt owed to the IMF and the World Bank. This is mainly commercial debt owed to commercial sovereign bond holders. Now, the interest of those is complicated, but in the last analysis, the interest of those bondholders is taking precedence over the rights of people, in my view. Intellectual property rules that drive up the prices of basic pharmaceuticals for many countries. That goes way beyond aid. Think of you mentioned the wealth tax. Actually, the Brazilians also commissioned a G20 paper from Gabriel Zucman looking at what could be achieved through a wealth tax. And the striking figure that he came up with is that if you had a 2% tax on billionaire wealth, I can't remember how many billionaires there are in the world. I think it's 350 or something. But it would generate something like 250 billion US dollars. Now, this is a group of people who pay lower marginal tax rates than working people in the UK. The amount that would be generated is about double international aid. So it just gives you some sort of context of why we shouldn't think of aid as the be-all and end-all of development. On the democracy point, I agree with you. I mean, the people who don't like democracy are usually called autocrats. So I think we can dismiss that. I mean, there is a general point, though, in what you raised, that one of the things, Claire, that you did as Development Secretary was really pushed general budget support, to provide support through government budgets. Now, of course, that comes with some risks, but the alternative is you do it all through fragmented projects that donors try to control. And a classic example of this, the World Bank has 400 trust funds. Now, these are special funds which are financed by individual donors, where the donor says to the World Bank, here's the money, you have to spend it in the countries we tell you to spend it, on the sectors we tell you to spend it on, using the accounting rules that we ask you to implement.
Well, don't have to take it.
They don't have to take it, but they do.
Yeah, I know.
But they do. Now, that's a fragmented, high transaction cost, inefficient, low impact system, and that could be changed.
But the point that aid can undermine democratic accountability, as can having lots of mining and oil. When governments don't have to tax in order to run things, they don't have to listen to their people. And that's the resource curse and all that. And aid can be a bit of that if it's not. That's the beauty of doing it with governments, because then the people can say you're not spending that money right.
Okay, this time I'm actually going to give more men the chance to speak because I've gone slightly in the wrong direction. So we're going to start with the man right at the back there, and then after the man here with the very nice, I don't know what you call that. Okay, I'm going to come to you next time. You'll be first. And then upstairs, I want to have the lady right here. Okay.
Yes, so my question would be about to Mr. Watkins. You mentioned the financing gap between what the World Bank spends and what should be spent. And while working for the Swiss Economic Ministry in the Trade Promotion Department, we set up a public-private partnership, and where sort of a co-financing mechanism would be established for coffee traders to invest into sustainable coffee projects. Do you see that as a mechanism that is sustainable within this gap and a sort of effective way of bridging this gap, or what's your opinion on that?
Okay, lady upstairs.
Hi, so I just quickly want to refocus on Africa. So just a month ago was FOCAC, so the China-Africa Conference. And just thinking about China's role in Africa quickly, very little of the funding that they kind of allocate to Africa or whatever is actually in the form of aid. A lot of it is, helping with industrial policy, like in Zimbabwe. They have agreed to beneficiate the lithium there in exchange for a bunch of other stuff. And I was wondering what it would take for the UK to take up such a role, because currently they're kind of neglecting Africa. I mean, if you look at post-Brexit, they just took the SADC EU EPA and they just kind of slapped UK on it and made the Southern African Customs Union Mozambique EPA out of it, but they didn't really change much. They haven't renegotiated a lot of their agreements. So I was just wondering, not necessarily just in terms of aid, but in terms of, trade and industrial policy, if, Britain would take up that role or take it more seriously.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman downstairs, who I understand is an old friend.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to hear Claire and Kevin to talk this important topic. And I think if we had more people like them in these departments for ages, maybe the aid would work. But my question is really, I want to ask you, an institution as well as people who are experienced in development aid, Western countries and Britain and US and all other Western countries, have known how to develop, know the knowledge and expertise and skills how to develop. My question is there an honesty that Western countries want these least developed countries to develop? Humanitarian aspect, I understand that's really periodic, something we cannot prevent, and it's generous that you come and help. But my question is, for example, a small country, I came from a small country, but we have a vast coast, we have minerals, we have livestock.
He's from Somaliland.
He's from Somaliland.
Not
Therefore,
Somalia,
Somaliland, yes. Therefore, my question is, from LSE thinkers and people in government and Kevin, is there an honesty in the Western world that you really want this country to come out of poverty and develop? Is that discussion in top levels of governments and institutions takes place, or is it this way of helping forever? That's my question.
Okay, thank you. I don't know, do you want to start this time, Karen?
I was hoping you'd give that one to Ken.
But the last one first.
Okay.
This guy used to live in my constituency, by the way. I know his mum. I think the honest answer is no, they don't want development, because we would have made more progress if they did. But they think development is aid. That's part of the problem. And the lack of challenge for the inequities in the whole international system has been too weak. And in the whole dialogue on development, that strand of the argument has been too weak. So we need to bring that forward in a much bigger way. There's an obsession with aid, and you need a bit of money. I mean, just as every country needs some public expenditure. But if that's all there is, we won't transform it. So do they really want it? Well, I mean, if you look at the World Bank was formed to bring development to Europe after the Second World War. And then there was a big effort out of the US in particular for Japan, Korea to recover, and they did. So when they see it as strategically crucial, it can happen. And when they don't, it doesn't. But we mustn't just say, oh dear, that's terrible, then we can't do anything, because we need that critique smartly and clearly. I mean, you're the next generation, you've got to make all this better. So that, you know, and your studies and your dissertations can start making these things clearer. The young lady up there, you said China tends to invest in infrastructure and so on. What do you call it? Not the Silk Road, the worldwide.
The Belt and Road.
Belt and Road. And they invest in roads and water and sanitation, which you need. But in the case of Britain and many others, we had a thing, we used to call it the Commonwealth Development Corporation. It's now called something awful.
Yeah, something else.
Liz Truss changed the name to British Investment. But there's a lot of money in it, and its rules make it have to focus on the poorest countries, and that can back infrastructure and so on. And that should be complementary. One is getting kids educated and immunised and so on, and government institutions working. That was reorganised actually in my time and then again to try to get the public sector money partnering with private sector money that won't go into poorer countries but might bring it in. So yes, it's very important what you raise, and yes, there has been work on it, and that isn't included in the discussion of development either. You're right. Your World Bank and coffee. I mean, I presume you did a trust fund in the World Bank? No, to do it. Because there is I can't remember what the name of it is, but a thing that we put together, and then all the Scandinavians are in it, of using aid to leverage more investment in things like coffee production, so that countries can get more, not just, because Germany is the biggest exporter of coffee, and it's because it doesn't grow coffee, but the coffee beans come out of Africa and then they get ground and exported to the world. So we do need all those kind of changes, so it's a good thing to back, but you need to get it to scale, ideally.
Do you have anything to
I
add?
do, yeah. Maybe on response to the three questions. First of all, the question about development, to take that one first. You're definitely in the right place to be asking that question. I think the Department for International Development, these questions have been really at the heart of thinking about development for a long time. If you think of Samir Amin and Ariri and all these people who have sort of argued that there's a tension between growth in the rich part of the world, capturing value and transferring resources from the poor part of the world and getting progressively left further behind. And that does describe the situation of very many countries. And the question of how countries can climb value chains is really critical. I mean, Claire's right. I think I'm right in saying something like 90% of the value of coffee and cocoa is actually transferred from West Africa through processing chains and retail chains. And finally, so the value added happens in the rich part of the world. The raw material production happens in the poor part of the world.
Even the fair trade chocolate. The processing is done out of Africa, so most of the money.
Yeah, and an even bigger example actually is mining. Where the transfer of wealth through the mining sector, including tax evasion by the mining sector. Now, these are things that can be addressed, but they're really tough. The specific question that you raised, I think, is really about blended finance, if I understand it. So it's, and just to explain, so this is the idea that you bring in private capital by creating incentives, by sharing risk between the private capital, and international public finance. And the World Bank is getting very big on this. And it clearly does have a role to play, and especially in the sector that you mentioned. But I can't help thinking that the level of interest in blended capital has gone up more and more as countries have committed less and less to public finance. And actually, to leverage private capital, you need domestic and international public investment as well. You don't get one without the other. Actually, that report that I mentioned, the independent expert group of the G20, looks at that in some detail. So I'd really encourage you to take a look at that. On China... Is
that the one that you wrote for the Brazil?
No, it's not the one I
okay.
wrote. Sadly, it's even better. It's better than the one I wrote. But it's I mean, look, just to give you a sense of what they say the numbers are in that report. So they say there's a 3 trillion financing gap, around 1 trillion of which has to come through the international development financing system. But another trillion, they argue, needs to come through private capital, and that's only going to happen with some sort of leveraging, of which your example is a sort of microcosm in a way. Look, I think China is a real conundrum, to be honest with you, because the Chinese approach to development financing is completely different than the OECD model, and it's caused a lot of friction. So the OECD model has a very strict dichotomy between concessional aid, which is essentially grant financing, or predominantly grant financing, and commercial aid. The Chinese development institutions don't operate that model. They blend commercial aid with development finance aid, and they often leverage it or use as collateral domestic resources or domestic infrastructure or exports of cobalt and minerals. And there are good sides to the model, because it's basically saying countries, as Claire's already said, don't develop through aid alone. Countries develop through investment, through infrastructure, through productivity. The flip side of a lot of this aid is unaccountable. A lot of it is, and one consequence of the accountability is it is leveraged against future revenue streams which aren't reported to national legislatures or civil society. And that's a big downside. I mean, Chinese debt, let's not mince words, is a big part of the debt problem. Almost as big, actually, as a sovereign bondholder debt part of the problem. So I don't really have a straight yes or no question on China.
I think one thing to add, because we had a cutting edge last year about Chinese investment, and one of the things that I took from that talk, or it was a panel of speakers, was the sense of not looking at China static, that there's a process of Chinese investors and government learning how to do this over time.
Yeah.
And there's a sense that Chinese investment has also decreased, particularly when it comes to Africa and particularly in certain areas of infrastructure. So it's important to kind of see that this is a process, you know, and it's going through change, and Chinese government and private investors are learning, you know, they're newer actors as well.
And of course, all the propaganda against China means everyone says it's all useless and all the debt is Chinese, and that just isn't true. It's more nuanced and complicated than that, of course. The other thing to say, I mean, the old Commonwealth Development Corporation and now the British Investment, whatever the heck it's called, is doing what you're talking about. I mean, it's using aid money, donor money, to leverage and try to encourage private investment. So we have got some of that in the system, and we probably need to make it work better. But and lots of money's been put in, because Priti Patel, who was briefly the development secretary, I don't know if you heard of her, she didn't last long. She went to Israel and, without telling anyone. But anyway, she put $6 billion into, because she hated spending it on poor people. But it increased the budget of this.
Yeah. Whatever.
I feel like we might get sued
British
for
investment.
this. Okay,
Well, can
yeah.
I do one really quick one? I mean, look, the numbers on blended finance are really important, because it's become this sort of mystical thing that's going to save the world or whatever. Like, you know, the reality is that the World Bank and, you know, many independent experts say that to generate resources on the scale that you need to tackle the green transition and so on, you need to leverage about $4 or $5 in private investment for every $1 of risk guarantee that you put in. That's the sort of ballpark number. The current leveraging ratio is about 1 to 1. And that is not a sustainable model. So, you know, this is, it's a great dissertation subject if you're looking for one.
And there are various initiatives. I mean, we did it in my time of using aid to try and leverage in different ways, reduce risk. So there are models out there. It's not easy to do. Like all good ideas, you have to work at it.
Okay, so we're going to take some more questions, starting with the lady here. And then upstairs, this gentleman at the back. And because I'm so intersectional, I'm even going to go with somebody that doesn't have a chair at the end. Oh, it was actually the lady behind you. I'm sorry about that. Okay. But I'll come back to you next time.
Take both.
We'll take both. That's a good idea. Okay.
All right. So, I mean, as you have rightly highlighted the horrific genocide that's going on in Gaza, can you please highlight that what is the British government doing in terms of aid for the Gazans? Like, what is the aid architecture like currently? And if you can maybe critically analyze it, like what it is like.
Thank you very much.
Did you say for Gaza?
Yeah.
And the lady in front of you.
Thank you. My question is also about the statement about solidarity versus charity. And I want to ask, in Britain, given its imperialist past, is there any discourse about aid being a matter of duty and accountability?
And reparation.
Yes.
Okay, and upstairs, the gentleman.
Hey, so my question's for Claire.
Could you put the microphone a little closer to your mouth?
So with you placing such a high level of importance on government systems and opening dialogues with local governments...
Where's the person?
He's up here.
At the back there.
Okay, thank you, yeah.
Right, so how would you deliver aid in like the Sahel region where it's so rife with conflict, there's terror groups, etc., the coups are coming constantly? How would you even approach that?
So I don't know if you caught the beginning of that, Claire. It was about, because you place emphasis on governments. Okay.
And how, in what areas are you saying?
The Sahel.
Let's look at the Sahel, so, yeah.
And the gentleman at the back without a seat.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for these contributions. It's very interesting. But there has been some talk here about democracy and going beyond aid, in the sense of if you have raw materials getting refined and contributing to the GDPs of the dominant countries, right? We've seen, for example, now in the Sahel, you can check the numbers in the Afrobarometer the past 20 years, non-existent support towards democracy, and now they have some military juntas who are running double-digit growth, who are creating industries, national industries, who are refining the gold, for example, or other materials, and gain popular support. So you see this movement towards maybe like the Chinese movement, some state-led development. And what are your thoughts on that, right? Because if you have a democracy that's been around for 50 years and it's running all of its budget on development cooperation, or you have partnerships such as the Cotonou or now the new Samoa Agreement, in which half the budget goes towards migration or security, climate, etc., matters that are not perhaps first in the agenda. What are your thoughts on that? How do you see these developments?
I want to thank all of you guys for really good questions. This is the end of week 1, so I can't imagine what the questions will be like in week 10.
Yeah, I'm really glad it's week 1.
You mean you wouldn't want to come back in week 10?
Probably not. Look, they're all great questions. Actually, the last one was a particularly tricky one, so I'm going to let Clare take that one. Look, on Gaza, I actually visited Gaza during, when I was working with Save the Children. And at the time, I thought it was, one of the most violent, dislocated. This was before, obviously, what we're seeing now.
Oh.
And a third of children, when I visited, around a third, there's a study in the Lancet that looked at trauma among children in Gaza, and around a third were traumatized. That was the highest level of any country in the world. What you've seen now is the destruction of the health. I mean, apart from the trauma that comes with loss and the anxiety and the fear that so many children and their parents have suffered, you've seen 90% of schools either fully destroyed or badly damaged. You've seen the majority of health centres either fully destroyed or partially damaged. You've got a humanitarian system that is struggling to maintain a trickle of support. So, I would submit this is not a humanitarian problem. This is ultimately going to be a problem of reconstruction, and not just reconstruction of the physical infrastructure, but of providing psychological. There's no point building schools and plonking children back in classrooms who have lost parents, who have spent over a year living with acute anxiety. So this is going to take a completely different way of thinking about international support. There are many amazing organizations in Gaza who are working in all of these areas. It's mostly relatively small scale. It really urgently will need to be scaled up. So there's no easy answer to that question. This is where the UN could make a difference, because there's obviously going to be all sorts of questions about how do you channel financial resources into Gaza and that sort of thing. There was a question on aid and reparations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah? Oh, yeah, solidarity.
Yeah. Look, I think it's a great question, because it does go to the heart of it that aid is ultimately constructed and thought of as a way of transferring resources, but it's not a vehicle for acknowledging responsibility. And that is, in my view, starting to change principally because of the climate crisis. So, when you look at things like the Loss and the Damage Fund, and I know it's tiny, but symbolically, that's quite a big step forward, for richer countries to acknowledge that they not only have a scientifically proven responsibility, but a financial responsibility to address the damage they cause. I guess the bigger debate, and I don't have an easy answer to it, like, I mean, how do you fully account for and pay for the racism, the colonialism, the wrongs of the past? To my mind, that's a tough exercise, and I'm not sure practically what you do with it as part of a reform agenda.
Well, that's cheerful.
Sorry about that.
I've been to Gaza 5 or 6 times. I never found it violent. Obviously it's been bombed repeatedly and never to this degree. I think there's no question that this is genocidal in intent. I mean, there's lots of evidence that, it's good old South Africa taking the case, and all the evidence, and they were trying to just decimate it and push the population out. And now they've decimated it. I mean, they've destroyed mosques, schools, healthcare, hospitals, people,
universities.
Everything. It's deliberate. And there's even these films of soldiers showing they stole people's underwear, women's. All of it is. And of course, the court that said there's a probability of genocide is yet to properly report, but I'm sure it will. And in the meantime, America sends bombs every week, and we send smaller bombs or bits for aeroplanes. So this is unforgivable and monstrous. On food, they also deliberately have excluded. There's lots of lorries waiting with food to come in, and the UNRWA, the UN agency for refugees, which Israel hates because it means the people who were refugees are still labelled as refugees, is there and ready to distribute, and they've kept the food out. And it's completely deliberate. And of course the people were traumatised before. There are a number of solidarity organisations and mental health workers across the world with Palestine. But the evidence from Srebrenica and so on is actually to help people recover. It's not so much psychological treatment as giving them normality back. On what's effective. Yeah. But I went to southern Lebanon after the 2006 invasion, and right near the southern border, there was a man building a most fabulous house, and this was Qatar, I think, was putting in money, and I said, "This is a fantastic house. Was your previous house as good as this?" He said, "No. This is a better house, and if they come again, I will build an even bigger one." The point being about Gaza, if the borders are opened, the Gulf states would put in money as well, and people would rebuild. They're fantastically brave and creative people. And of course they're traumatised, of course they've lost lots of people, of course there's lots of desperately damaged and injured people, as well as terrible loss of family members. But rebuilding is a bit healing. Nothing can make this right. And I think Israel has lost all moral compass, and the support from the Western countries is equally guilty. They couldn't be doing this without it, and it's enormously serious, and it's not over yet. Well, now they're pummeling Lebanon. But people will survive and they will rebuild, and their legitimacy is diminished and diminished and diminished. But there's nothing very easy and good to say at this moment, except there's a demonstration on Saturday. Come. The next question was solidarity versus charity, or a duty. Reparations. But I'm back to my fundamental point. We're all in trouble. And if we don't develop the world more evenly, none of us will be okay. So, yes, there's a duty, but it's not even reparations. It's the interest of everyone in the world to have a more safe future for everyone. And we're living at a time when there's lots of knowledge, new technologies, there's lots of capital being badly used. It would be possible to have a massive improvement across the globe. And that's what needs doing, and it's up to your generation to do it. The Sahel is another disaster. The second guy, because you both spoke about the Sahel, didn't you? Someone up there. Yes.
No,
And there was a democracy.
Oh, yes, sorry, up there.
Yeah.
Yes, he did. And
yeah.
It's been, I mean, they're very anti-French. You know, it was predominantly influenced by France, and the people in the Sahel don't want France, and they went over to Russia and all that. Of course, it's very dry and arid, and that's got worse with climate change. I mean, I think you talked as though the gold is being well used now. No, there's a semi-criminal element in it. It's all disastrous. But the West has completely let down the Sahel, and it's very chaotic, and people are suffering, and I don't know what's going to come out. Do you? They're running double-digit one. I don't think the new governments are doing very well by the people. I mean, it's not. That's a romance that I think wouldn't stand scrutiny.
The way that I responded to your question was that for democracy to gain legitimacy, it has to actually be able to deliver on development. And this is something our late colleague Tandika Makandawire talked about, that democracy isn't just about having elections. It's about governments being able to meet the needs of people. And if we want a world in which democracy is seen as beneficial in polls, then we need a much better international system that aims at strengthening those democracies. And
but it was the people who overthrew the previous governments. They were very flawed democracies anyway. It's just I don't think we should go down the rabbit hole of saying, oh, democracy doesn't work, let's get some dictators to do things. No, I know you're not. I know you're not, but I don't think we should be tempted to that. And I mean, the people overthrew the previous governments, they were so fed up with them, but the present situation is pretty awful as well. It hasn't improved at all.
Okay, I want to take one last question because I gave her a smile and she might be angry, but then we do have to close up. So it's the lady right here, and all of the other people, you can come and ask them questions in the pub. Definitely Claire, I'm not sure about Kevin.
Hello. First of all, thank you for talking about the Middle East. I'm Lebanese.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, out of both of your experiences, do you think aid is a way to cover political stances? And by that I mean the UK is funding arms for Israel, but at the same time sending aid to Lebanon.
Okay, so we'll just finish with this question. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm not aware that the UK is sending very much aid to Lebanon. But governments do this tokenistically, of course. And of course, some of the planes that are bombing Lebanon, Britain's provided a part that's in those planes. So Britain isn't a big provider, but there's a crucial component in those planes that are doing all the bombing that comes from Britain, and that's the bit that hasn't been halted when they halted some of the arms exports. We talked early on about the hypocrisy of aid. This is hypocrisy, right? Oh, and they say that, and Cameron did it a lot. We are so busy trying to get aid to the people of Gaza because, so let's kill them and then we'll send them some aid. So, on the other hand, people who need everything. But I mean, it's hypocritical nonsense. Don't be fooled. Grab whatever you can get. I'm so sorry. What's happening to your country again? Can't believe it.
I don't know if you want to add anything, Kevin, before we close up.
Well, that's a very powerful way of putting it. If you think about Lebanon's experience, and again, like I'm super sorry that you're going through that, but most Syrian refugees actually went to Lebanon. Of course, many went to Turkey as well. That roughly doubled the school-age population of Lebanon. The international aid response was absolutely appalling. And it was appalling partly because Lebanon then was nominally a middle-income country. and so didn't even qualify for World Bank concessional aid. So, you know, the multilateral development banks did very little. The Lebanese government and the Lebanese people did extraordinary things. I mean, try and imagine in the UK doubling the primary school population. What would happen to the education system? You know, Lebanon put in place a double shift system. You know, it made an extraordinary effort to enable Syrian kids to rebuild their lives. And now what we're seeing, you know, like Clare, you know, it's so appalling, it sort of takes your breath away. And you end up thinking, is this me? Am I reading the news in the wrong way? That, you know, when you see a government minister say, you know, we're working with urgency to get some tents to North Beirut, and, you know, at the same time we're turning a blind eye. You know, we're basically authorizing and endorsing what Israel is doing in the south of Lebanon, but we're providing some tents. So the bombs that we made, which Israel can drop on people when their homes are destroyed, they can live in the tents that we're providing through humanitarian aid. I mean, that's a perversion of any concept of justice, in my view. And using aid as part of that, I think just adds insult to injury.
And just to add, there are some large Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon as well, and they have grown in size, and some of them have been there since '48, and they're not entitled to work fully in, you know, they've got limited rights, and they're sitting there seething and watching Gaza. So all this is unbearable, really.
Okay, I don't really
join the march, please. Seriously.
Yeah, and end on a more positive note. I do want us to thank our speakers so much for coming and talking with us today. It was such wonderful to have you guys come and speak, and we have you every year, and every year I learn a lot from you. Next week we have a talk on the crisis of peacekeeping, which is very relevant of many of the things that we discussed today, by Marsha Henry from Queen's University in Belfast, and with Mafwanui James from our own department as the discussant. So please come back. We're now going to go over to the White Horse Pub. So if you have more questions, you can ask there. But I hope you all have wonderful weekends, and yeah.